As part of our One Book, One Congregation series on the book, Here All Along by Sarah Hurwitz, each month I'm going to give a Devar Torah about one of the chapters. And tonight I'm going to be talking about chapter 3, which is entitled, Freeing God from His Human-Shaped Cage in the Sky, in which Sarah Hurwitz takes on the complicated topic of how do we understand and relate to God in Jewish tradition. I decided I needed to talk about it this week because our Torah portion dovetails perfectly with this topic. As I alluded to earlier, we read about the dream that Jacob has. As we read in this week's Torah portion, now Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until the rise of dawn. When the man saw that he could not overcome him, he struck Jacob's hip socket, so that Jacob's hip socket was wrenched as the man wrestled with him. Then he said, "Let me go, dawn is breaking." But Jacob said, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." The other said to him, "What is your name?" And he said, "Jacob." "No more shall you be called Jacob, but Israel," said the other, "for you have struggled with God and with human beings, and you have prevailed." Then Jacob asked, "Pray tell me now your name." But he said, "Why do you ask my name?" And then he took his leave of him. Sarah Hurwitz, in her chapter on God, mentions, of course, this Torah story in which Jacob wrestles with beings, human and divine. And she tries to wrestle in this chapter with conceptions of God. She said, "When I was growing up, the only conceptions of God that I knew were those that I learned from the prayer book. There was God that was Father and King. We know that image well from the High Holy Days of Avinu Malkeinu. And that God seemed to be up in the sky and performing miracles, and God was definitely in the prayer book, I, him. God was male." She said, I couldn't believe in a God like this. I don't believe in God as a supernatural being. There was something out there, she said, that I felt, but I couldn't call that being God. And so I'd given up on the idea of God. And she's certainly not alone. 72% of Jews versus 97% of Christians believe in God or a universal spirit. Only 34% of Jews are absolutely certain of that belief, compared to 78% of Christians, and 30% of those who are unaffiliated, what demographers call nuns, not N-U-N-S, but N-O-N-E-S, nuns, no religion. So that Jewish belief is similar to people who have no faith at all. Why is that? Why are Christians so much more believing in God than Jews do? Well, I think that one of the explanations is, as I often teach my students, is that Judaism is a religion of deed, not creed. That Judaism teaches us about what we are supposed to do, what our obligations are to other human beings, how we are to treat the earth, the positive and negative commandments, how we set up our judicial system, ritual commandments that teach us how to behave in many moments of our lives, the many prayers that we say, the strict rules that we have for Shabbat. This is what it means to be a Jew. Many of us could say what we need to do for a Passover Seder more than we could say what we believe in God or not, because Judaism is about doing. That we don't require anybody to make a statement of faith to be Jewish. You're Jewish if you're born Jewish. You're Jewish if you're raised Jewish. You're Jewish if you decide you want to become Jewish. But even if you choose to convert to Judaism, no one requires you to say this is what you need to believe. And so perhaps it's no surprise that Jews struggle mightily with the idea of God. And then Sarah Hurwitz talks in her book about how she began to open up the idea of what God could be in her life. She said she went on a meditation retreat and found it incredibly difficult. As she was sitting there quietly and was told to be non-judgmental about her thoughts, and thoughts kept arising and she kept judging them and feeling frustrated. A few days into the retreat, the teachers gave them an assignment to go off and to do a practice that's known as Hit Bodedut. Hit Bodedut is a practice in which one goes off into a quiet place by themselves and speaks aloud to God. There are rabbis, particularly some of the Hasidic rabbis, who like to do this. They would like to go out into the woods or into other natural places, and they would have conversations aloud with God, not quietly, not silent prayer, but aloud. The teachers gave them instructions on how to do it. Just start to talk and just see what comes out. Don't worry about what you're saying. Nobody is paying attention to you. You're off on your own. But of course, it's a little bit challenging to talk to God if you're not sure if you believe in God and you think it's a little strange to be standing somewhere in the middle of the woods on a retreat talking aloud to nobody in particular. After the experience, which she found frustrating, she had a meeting with one of the teachers, Rabbi James Jacobson Meisels, who's considered to be one of the foremost teachers of meditation in the world today. He lives in Israel. And he asked her this question: have you been to a black church? Well, of course Sarah Hurwitz had been to a black church. She was Michelle Obama's speechwriter. She had spent a lot of time on the campaign trail in black churches. And then he said, well, what do you think the people were doing there? And she said, well, I found it always incredibly uplifting. You go into a black church and people stand and they clap and they emote and they express themselves. It's not like going into a synagogue where Jews are much more polite. She said, I understand that they probably were speaking to God, and I respect that, but me, I don't believe in God. And then she said something began to shift. The next day, she was in meditation. A thought arose in her mind. You created me like this, she said. You created me like this. Who created me like this? As she's looking around and thinking, I'm talking to God now. And she continued to do Hit Bodedut practice, continued to walk out into the wilderness and to speak aloud to the universe. And there was a prayer that emerged for her. And the prayer that emerged for her was a simple one. Stay with me. Stay with me, God. She said, I don't know what it was. I just felt there was a deep sense of connection at that moment. It wasn't about any kind of intellectual process of what I think about God. There was a sense, a feeling of connectedness at that moment. There's an exercise about spirituality that I like to do with my 12th grade Kabbalah Torah students. And the exercise goes like this. I ask them to jot down notes about different times that they felt spiritual in their lives. I don't define spiritual for them. I say, you define it the way you want to. But I ask them to write a time you felt spiritual in nature, a time you felt spiritual at a life cycle event, a time you felt spiritual, and I have about 10 or 12 different times, and they jot their notes down. And then I say, I want you to complete this sentence. To be spiritual is. And you're going to complete that sentence by looking at all of those notes you wrote and to see what the common thread is among all of them. And 90% of the time, if not more, what the students write is to be spiritual is to be connected. To connected to other people, connected to nature, more deeply connected with themselves, just like Sarah Hurwitz experienced some sense of deep connection with the universe. That in order to really begin to talk about God, perhaps what she learned and what we can learn is not to do it in an intellectual way, but experientially. To start with our own experience and not with theology. Rabbi Larry Kushner, who was my teacher in rabbinic school, shares an exercise that he used to do with his students. And when he would ask them the question, do you believe in God? They would all say no. And then he would change the question around and say, tell me about an experience you had with God. And they all had something they could share. To start with experience and not theology, just like Sarah Hurwitz learned. Or as my teacher, Rabbi Art Green, teaches, in the midst of life, our ordinariness is interrupted. This is what it means to have an inkling of the divine. Perhaps it's a new life or a death or other life cycle moment. In nature, a loving connection with another, a deep inner stillness or loud rush of excitement that fills us to overflowing. The simplistic old man in the sky who controls everything God that Sarah Hurwitz doesn't believe in, frankly, Judaism doesn't believe in either. God is not a genie in a bottle who grants us wishes. And when we say that God answers prayers, it doesn't mean that God answers our prayer by saying yes, because if that were the case, God would just be a dream granter. But that's not what God is in the universe. God is a place in the universe, perhaps, that asks us of something, to do something, to be something. Perhaps God, in our prayer, if we listen carefully, is giving us another answer about how we need to be. That expecting that an answer to a prayer is meaning that God says yes is rather childish and simplistic. And then she talks about various God ideas that we have within our tradition. The first, this idea of God as the old man in the sky, is that God is all-powerful, all-knowing, all-good. And then the first thing she says is, that's not even the God of the Torah. Because if we look within Torah, God seems surprised by the choices that human beings make. Right from the very beginning, when God creates human beings, they disobey God. If God was all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-good, why do we have stories in Torah in which people disobey God? God could control that. Well, maybe God doesn't want to, or God can't. So this idea that God is all-powerful and all-knowing and all-good belies what we see already in Torah. Later on, the rabbis talk about how God demands of us to behave in certain ways. And then they have to deal with the conundrum of what happens when bad things happen to good people. And they grapple with that in several different ways. One, of course, that we know about is that there's a reward in the afterlife, a concept that we think of as much more Christian than Jewish, but we do have that concept in Judaism. It's not a major thread, but that there is an afterlife, and that if we are punished in this world, but we really deserve something else, we'll be rewarded later. More often than not, the rabbis say, we just can't always understand God's ways. And so when we see bad things happening, perhaps we just don't understand. It's not a terribly satisfying concept of God. Frankly, not one that I ascribe to, and neither does she. But then she goes on to look at other ways in which to think about God. God is radically transcendent, meaning God is so far away from us, we can't even have a real personal relationship with God. And this is something that Maimonides, the great medieval scholar, posits, is that the only thing that we can say about God is what God is not, because God is not at all like us. And so we can't know God in that very personal and deep way. We can, however, know, love, and emulate God based on what we see in the world as goodness. And the example she gives is we see God as an anonymous donor who contributes to various charities. We don't know if the donor is just or merciful in what they are doing, but their actions are. And so when we see good in the world, we could perhaps see an inkling of God. And something that I love about Maimonides' philosophy is that he encourages us to learn about the world in all of its aspects. Science, philosophy, math, religion. There is nothing that's outside of God. That to say, is it religion or science? Maimonides does not believe in that dichotomy. That activating our intellect, that learning and growing in all the ways we can as human beings is the way in which we understand the God who created the universe, and so that nothing, no way of thinking or being is outside of God. And then there's the idea that God is everything, and this is a non-dualist way of thinking about God, that there's no distinction between us and God, or us and anyone else. As the psalmist says, "Ein od milvado," there is nothing else but God, it is all God. That the physical manifestations we see in the world are not the whole truth of our reality, that there is a greater truth in which we are all deeply connected, and that's what we're moving towards in a spiritual sense. The Baal Shem Tov, the founder of the Hasidic movement, said there is therefore absolutely nothing that is devoid of God's essence. We can think about God as the great force of life, the cosmic breath that dwells at the center of all being, the inner force of existence itself, the single unifying substratum. There is a story about two waves in the ocean, a short wave and a tall wave. And they are moving towards the shore, and the tall wave sees that what happens when the waves get to the shore is that they crash and they break and they disappear. And the tall wave begins to panic and turns to the short wave and says, "We're going to die." Well, the short wave is nonplussed because the short wave can't see what's happening at the shore. And the short wave turns to the tall wave and says, "I have 6 words for you, that if you understand them, you would see that there is no reason to fear." And the tall wave says, "Yes, please tell me what those words are." And the short wave turns to the tall wave and says, "You're not a wave, you're water." You're not a wave, you're water. We're all connected to the whole. That if God is the ocean and each of us is a separate wave, that we are not separate from that. That we're all connected to each other and to the wholeness in the universe we call God. And the purpose of spiritual practice, as Jay Michelson teaches, is to return to the experience of duality while maintaining the consciousness of unity, which is what I was trying to share with you earlier, that when we sit in meditation quietly and we feel that sense of wholeness and connection that we can't always feel in our day-to-day lives because we live in this split reality, a reality in which there is separateness, but we can experience a sense of unity and then bring that into the world of duality, a sense of focus and centeredness and wholeness. And then she talks about what Mordecai Kaplan, the founder of the Reconstructionist movement, said, is that God is an actualizing force. God is the power that makes for salvation. And Martin Buber talks about God is in relationships. What he talks about is the I-thou relationship, the profound and deep connections we have with one another. One of the critiques of Martin Buber was that if we have this connection with God that is just a deep and profound feeling of relationship, what motivates us to do the mitzvot? What motivates us to do good things in the world? And Martin Buber explains the motivation for mitzvot in such a beautiful way. And he says, when we're in a deep and loving relationship with another person, we do things for them not because they tell us to, not because we have a sense of obligation or commandedness, but we do things for people we love because we care about them, because we want to be in that relationship. And so the motivation of doing the right things in the world is because we want to be in relationship with God, with divinity, with the possibility of what the world could be. And so we do it not out of a sense of guilt, but out of a sense of deep connection. And then he shares Heschel, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel's book, God in Search of Man, is that God needs us. God gets angry when we don't behave because God cares and wants us to do better, that God can't behave in the world without our hands and our hearts. As Rabbi Shai Held teaches, we move from ego-centeredness to other-centeredness when we believe in God. That when we believe in God and we act in the world as if God is present, it's not just all about us. It's about others. Like when my kids were little and sometimes they didn't want to do something. I don't want to go to that birthday party. I don't want to write that card. And I would say to them, there are things that we do in the world, not just that make us happy, but because we care about someone else, we do them. And to be a mature and grown-up person in the world is to do that more. It's to think about not just me, but what about the other person? What about my community? What if I don't show up? Who's going to be there? What if I don't do this? Who's going to be there? That's what it means to have faith in God in a Heschelian concept. And as he talks about it, he says, some are guilty for the things that happen in the world that are terrible, but all of us are responsible. We're all responsible for making the world a better place. And just because I can't do it all myself, and just because the world can seem broken and difficult and challenging, doesn't mean that I can back away from it, that my obligation as a person of faith is to go towards the problems, to work towards solutions. As Pirkei Avot teaches, Lo alecha hamlacha ligmor, v'lo ata ben chorin lehibatel mimena. It is not up to you to complete the task, but neither are you free to desist from it. That we have an obligation to others. Rabbi Harold Kushner teaches that God is good but not all-powerful. His very well-known bestseller, When Bad Things Happen to Good People, he posits God doesn't cause bad things to happen, but God does inspire human beings to respond. He doesn't try to answer the question of why bad things happen to good people. He says that's completely unknowable, but we can know that when something difficult happens, we have an opportunity to respond. And how do we respond? Do we respond with kindness and love? Do we respond with justice and peace? That's the power we have. God consoles me through you. And then there are those who believe that God is a process, that we are not human beings, but human becomings. I love that idea. That we are always unfolding, and that's even God's name, Yud He Vav He, is the verb to be, that we are human becomings. And God works through persuasion and invitation. So what does it mean to be a God wrestler like Jacob? It means to open ourselves up to the possibility that there is something beyond this plane of existence. Rabbi Toba Spitzer, in her wonderful new book, God is Here, Reimagining the Divine, says, quote, instead of arguing about whether God exists or fighting over whose version of God is true, I suggest that we explore what it means to live as beings who have a profound sensitivity to what has come to be called the sacred or the divine. Does my faith make me a better person? Does it challenge me to grow? To take responsibility beyond my own well-being? Does my faith comfort and strengthen me? Sarah Hurwitz, when she was struggling with her belief in God and feeling ridiculous, because she still couldn't get rid of this notion as God as this power in the sky, this genie in the bottle, this wish granter, she asked her teacher, Rabbi Jordan Ben Datapel, some of us learned from here when he used to live in Chicago. He helped her confront this struggle. And he said, maybe the question isn't whether believing in God is ridiculous or not. Maybe you should ask yourself, when I run this belief in God on my operating system, what happens? Am I more loving, more honest and courageous, more true to myself and present in my life? When I believe that the divine is present in every moment, I'm more able to approach my life from a posture of gratitude and wonder. This is what it means to have faith. What does it mean to be a God wrestler? To be humble, aware that we don't know everything. This allows us not to stray into extremism. As Rabbi Emanuel Rackman teaches, doubt is good for the human soul. And finally, what does it mean to be a God wrestler? I believe it means that we don't have all the answers and that we're okay with that. And that asking the questions and struggling is where the learning and the growth is. As Dr. Rachel Naomi Remen teaches, On a chapter she writes in her book, My Grandfather's Blessings, she writes a chapter called Mystery. And she concludes that chapter by saying, maybe the secret to living well is not in having all the answers, but wrestling with life's unanswerable questions in good company. And so I hope that we'll continue to wrestle, because this is what it means to be the children of Jacob, to be the children of Israel, to wrestle with our concepts of God, to help make us better human becomings in the world, continually growing, connecting, and loving. May this be what we learn about God as we continue to wrestle with these ideas. Amen. You rise together, page 186.
עלינו לשבח לאדון הכל, לתת גדולה ליוצא בראשית.